Alright, hello everyone. Today I'm just going to cover the 6 American warships that are involved in the November 14th to 15th night action off Guadalcanal. So there's 6 ships to cover here. They are the battleships South Dakota and the Washington, and the 4 destroyers, the Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn. So we'll go and start things off with USS Washington. Washington is a 35,000 ton vessel. She's a member of the North Carolina class. There's only one sister ship. That's North Carolina herself. She's 730 feet long and 108 feet wide. She can do 28 knots absolutely flat out, but generally the ship is limited to closer to 26 knots by vibration issues that were solved to varying degrees throughout the war with the propellers. She's got 4 props that are offset at different distances throughout the ship, as you can see here in this diagram. And she's got twin rudders that are directly in line with the inboard screws. She's got 2 smokestacks set fairly rearward of the conning tower. So I'm going to go ahead and break down some of the important features of the ship that pertain to how it performs during the battle. And that's mostly what we're going to be doing here. I'm not going to give a comprehensive study of each ship or each class of ship. I'm here to tell you what you need to know about each ship before we cover the battle itself later on in this series. So Washington is armed with 9 16-inch guns, 3 triple turrets, and she's got 20 5-inch guns that are split up into 10 twin-mounted turrets. There are 5 on each side of the superstructure, and those are dual purpose, so they are very good at both anti-aircraft and anti-surface work. This is a very versatile weapon system. Washington, somewhat unusual for a battleship, is not armored against her own guns. This is a weight-saving measure due to her being designed during the London Naval Treaty era, and as such, in order to save weight, she's only armored against 14-inch guns. And that's definitely going to matter when you're going up against the Japanese Navy, which has a whole lot of ships with 14-inch guns. Now, the 16s that she's carrying are something of an oddity in the navies of the world. Only 3 navies ever fielded ships with guns that large. That's the US, which had by far the most. The British had 2 ships, Nelson and Rodney. And the Japanese had 2 with 16s, and then, of course, the 2 famous ones with 18s, the Yamato class. So Washington is carrying a lot of firepower, even for a battleship of this era. So some other important fixtures of the ship, we're just going to go over the radar and fire control systems. Up top, you see the very large square antenna on the foremast. That is a CXAM air search radar. That is not going to play much of a role at all in the upcoming battle. Planes aren't really going to be involved, because this is a night action, and night flying and night fighting was something of a new development for aircraft, and they weren't really all that good at it yet. And this is one of those cases that kind of proves that, while people will often say that the aircraft carrier replaces the battleship in World War II, they definitely do not do so for night fighting. Aircraft carriers are just giant targets at night, whereas a battleship, especially with good optics or especially with great radar systems, are very, very effective combatants at night, as we're going to see later on in this battle. So that CXAM air search radar, not doing a whole lot. The SG-1 surface search radar, which is on the front side of the conning tower, and it's labeled here, that is going to play a very important role in this battle. Now, the surface search radar is the one that you're usually going to see in movies, with the big sweep. It's picking up contacts, 50, 100, depending on conditions, even further, more than 100 miles out. This is a pretty early system. Its range is going to vary, but still, it's a lot better than what most ships have. A lot of World War II ships still don't have radar at all. So the SG-1 is your surface search radar. That's looking all around the ship, or at least it would be if it was mounted in the right place, but we'll get to that in a second. So once you pick up those contacts with your surface search radar, then you're going to switch over to using your gun directors. So the Washington is equipped with 2 Mark 38 gun directors, and these are for the 16-inch guns. And each one of these has a Mark III radar on it. Now, the gun director is going to rotate to face the enemy target, and you're going to aim the radar at it. And that radar has a narrower, more focused beam, so it's going to give you a more precise picture of what the enemy is doing. In addition to that, the gun director itself is going to have really high-powered, high-quality optical sights that you can also use to get information on the distance, heading, speed of the enemy contact. Older gun directors aren't going to have radars at all, but these are the latest and greatest for the best battleships that the United States is producing at this time. Now, these positions, the main battery directors, they are referred to as Spot 1 and Spot 2. So Spot 1 is your forward gun director. It's going to be commanding the forward turrets. And Spot 2 is your aft gun director, and it's going to direct the rear turret. Once the gun director has the relevant information, it's going to feed it down into the bowels of the ship to a Mark 1 Able fire control computer. So think of it like the gun director is a sensor that's then feeding information into a computer. That computer is going to cross-reference that data with many other factors and data points, including the roll of the ship, the rotation of the Earth under the ships, and the ship's own speed and heading. Once it's calculated that, it's going to send that firing solution to the guns themselves, and the directors are, through the computers, telling the guns where to train to and where to elevate the barrels. Once that happens, generally the guns are fired from the plotting room where those computers are, as that's one of the most armored places in the ship, and as such, generally they're always going to be able to fire those guns no matter what's going on in the battle. In addition to the Mark 38 gun directors for the main batteries, Washington also has 4 Mark 37 gun directors, and each one of those has a Mark 4 radar on it. Those positions are called Sky 1 through 4, with Sky 1 being forward, Sky 4 being aft, and Sky 2 and 3 being mounted on the sides of the ship right next to the forward smokestack. And those radars are going to be able to pick up both surface and air contacts, as those guns are dual purpose, so they can be fired at aircraft and surface targets. Another important feature of these directors is that the 16-inch and 5-inch guns can each take direction from each other's directors. So if something happens to your 16-inch main battery directors, like let's say Spot 1 is hit, you can switch control of the forward turrets over to Sky 1. So that way you can still direct your guns. This isn't the most effective solution in the world, however, it's a lot better than using optical sights to aim the guns. One other important fixture to note here is going to be the OS-2U Kingfisher float planes that would normally be stationed on the tail end of the battleship. Those are going to be removed by the crew before they go into this action. This is because at night, as we said earlier, planes are going to do you a whole lot of good, even for spotting purposes, and they are going to be a massive liability. You're going to have aviation gas tanks back there, and the plane itself, if it gets hit, it blows up. It's just a giant flare illuminating your position. And once again, fire and illumination is going to play an important role in this battle. And indeed, it already had in several other surface actions off the coast of Guadalcanal in the weeks and months preceding this particular battle that we're talking about. Washington has painted up in a Measure 22 camouflage, which is a pretty standard looking camouflage pattern. The only really notable thing here is going to be that light gray stripe towards the front of the ship, running up the bow. It goes right through the hull number and around the anchor. That's one of the easier ways to tell Washington apart from some other ships during this time, although North Carolina later on will be painted in this same camouflage scheme. So go and roll forward. Here is a line drawing of the ship, and this is just to show you where those 5-inch directors are from above. Go and roll forward again. This is just to further illustrate some of those fire control systems. So up top, pointing off to what is the port side of the ship, is the CXAM air search radar. Alright, so just to the side of that CXAM air search radar, you can see the Spot 1 position. So that is your Mark 38 gun director for the main battery for the 16-inch guns, and it has its Mark 3 fire control radar mounted on top of it. Now, just under that, under the sky control bridge, you can see the SG-1 surface search radar. It's a really small unit, however, it is a very useful piece of equipment on this battle. Now, as you can see, it's mounted to the front side of the conning tower, And that means that when it rotates aft, it's just going to see conning tower. So there's a giant blind spot essentially that this radar has, and you would think that it would be better off up on one of the masts or on top of the conning tower, literally anywhere else. But unfortunately, the Bureau of Ordnance decided that it had to go here and it could go nowhere else, and the crew were not allowed to change this. So unfortunately, they were sailing into battle with a massive blind spot on their primary search radar. Now, just below and to the left of that, you have your forward Sky 1 position Mark 37 5-inch gun director, and it's Mark 4 radar. So in this photo you can see Spot 1 and Sky 1, and you can also see an example of every radar system that the ship has at this time. Alright, rolling forward here, I just wanted to point out while we were looking at this image, two differences in the conning tower between Washington and her sister ship North Carolina. Now the first difference is there from the day that these ships are built. Washington's sky control bridge has these sort of vent-looking structures or crenellations, these sort of outer layers on it, and North Carolina's is totally flat and smooth. Now this detail is going to be one that is easy to see in most pictures of both of these ships. So if you're trying to figure out if you're looking at Washington or North Carolina, that's a good way to tell. And then you can also see below the sky control bridge, North Carolina on the right in the color photo has what's called Stryker's Bridge, which is this it's this extra spotting bridge that is squared off on the back side. As you can see, it was added by a gunnery officer whose last name was Stryker, so it's referred to as Stryker's Bridge. And you can still see if you go visit North Carolina today. North Carolina is still afloat in the city of Wilmington. Washington, unfortunately, is no longer with us. And so North Carolina is the closest you're going to get to seeing Washington in person. And because they were sister ships, they are, of course, nearly identical. So that is a very good resource to have. Alright, as we roll on forward, this is just one more picture of that SG-1 surface search radar, because again, it's going to play a very important role. This is one of those 16-inch guns on a sort of moving truck type deal. And then here's just a couple more photos of Washington. This is her sailing underneath an American SBD. That's a scout and dive bombing plane. This photo is taken just after the battle that we're going to discuss. And then this right here is a colorized photo of Washington. I don't believe that this is an original color photo, but there she is again later on in the war, serving off of the coast of what looks like a Japanese-held island. Alright, so that covers most of the important details on the battleship Washington. Her hull number, by the way, is BB-56, and that should be just about everything that you need to know about the ship itself. So, in the next section, we're going to cover the USS South Dakota. Alright, so moving on now, we're going to go ahead and cover USS South Dakota. She's BB-57, the immediate follow-up to the Washington. And she's the lead ship of a brand new class of American battleships. So this is a completely new design following up the North Carolina class. Now, overall, these ships are still fairly similar to the North Carolinas. They are about the same shape, the same speed overall in most cases. However, size-wise, the South Dakota class are smaller ships. So South Dakota is 50 feet shorter, putting her right at about 680 feet, but she's going to maintain that same 108-foot width. This was done to shorten up the length of the ship that had to be armored, so that they could increase the total weight of the armor such that it would be resistant to 16-inch guns. And so that clears up that flaw with the North Carolina class where they were only armored against 14-inch guns. That's gone away with South Dakota. South Dakota also has a shorter superstructure in terms of its length, and she's only got one smokestack, and it is right behind the conning tower. So that's another easy way to tell these ships apart. Now, another really obvious difference is going to be the fact that while South Dakota does have the same 5-inch twin mount 38 caliber guns on each side of the superstructure, she's missing one on each side. So she has 4 on each side, and all of her sister ships have 5 on each side, just like the North Carolinas do. South Dakota had 2 of them removed in order to enclose some extra spaces and stay under weight limits in order to house an admiral and an admiral's staff, and so she could function as a fleet flagship. So in any photos, if you see one of these fast battleships and it's only got 4 of those 5-inch 38 twin mounts on each side, that's got to be South Dakota. Another design difference is going to be her screw and rudder arrangement. So she still has 4 props and 2 rudders. However, the outer propellers and the skegs, the platforms that they ride in, they now extend past the inboard propellers just slightly. This is done in theory to make the ship more survivable so that a torpedo, again in theory, would have a much harder time damaging multiple propellers and rudders with a single impact. In reality, these ships never took torpedoes, so no one really knows how well that would have worked in practice. But that is another rather notable difference between the South Dakota class and the North Carolina class. South Dakota herself is pictured here. Now, the paint job is somewhat inaccurate. She does not have the Measure 22 light gray stripe that Washington does. However, this was the best diagram of the ship I could find to talk about it. Now, it does not show her OS2U Kingfisher float planes on board on the fantail. However, South Dakota did have her float planes when she goes into action, so just keep that in mind. Alright, so here I have the SG-1 surface search radar labeled. Unlike Washington, it is not mounted directly to the conning tower, but it's mounted on the outside of a observation platform near the top of the conning tower. There are no good close-up photos of this radar on South Dakota, at least not from this time period. However, I can roll some photos afterward that should prove that this is where the radar is mounted. Now, up above that, she has an SC radar. This is a large square radar that looks fairly similar to the CXAM that's mounted on Washington, but the SC differs in that it is both an air and surface search set, so it can find both surface and air targets. In this case, it would probably be more effective to have a CXAM, seeing as you have the SG-1 to do your surface search work. However, because the SC is mounted up on top of the mast, it is going to give you a full 360 sweep of air search capability and surface search capability, which is going to do better than the SG, which even on South Dakota here is still going to be looking right at a bunch of conning tower when it rotates aft. Alright, now as far as gun directors and fire control, South Dakota is basically identical to the Washington. She has the same equipment for Spot 1 and Spot 2. That's the Mark 38 gun directors with the Mark 3 radars, and the same 4 positions for Sky 1 through 4. Those are Mark 37 directors with Mark 4 radars, and they're in about the same positions that they are on Washington, and they're all labeled here. Alright, so moving on, I just need to talk briefly about some history of what the South Dakota was doing before this battle. She participated in the Battle of Santa Cruz and was tasked with guarding the aircraft carrier Enterprise, mostly through the use of her 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. However, during the battle, South Dakota actually takes a bomb hit from a Japanese plane, and the bomb hits the top of Turret 1. Now, Turret 1 was largely undamaged by this. However, the blast did damage the center and outer barrel of Turret 2, and these barrels overhang the top of Turret 1, and they got deep gouging in the barrel liners, such that they were unsure if these guns would be safe to fire in the near future. Fragmentation from the blast also flew up towards the bridge, and every officer on the bridge decided to duck when they saw this incoming debris. However, Thomas Gatch, the captain of the South Dakota, decided that throwing himself to the ground was beneath the dignity of the commanding officer of an American battleship, and so in a great show of bravery or stupidity, he doesn't flinch as the bomb blast comes up towards him, and for his troubles, he gets a piece of shrapnel cutting across his jugular and another piece of debris which severely injures his arm. Fortunately for him, the fast-acting corpsmen on board the South Dakota were able to save his life, and he was able to command his ship in the Battle of Guadalcanal that we are going to be discussing. So right here is a comparison between the sizes of the battleships that we've talked about and some of the other World War II era battleships. So these are their contemporaries. These are the ships that are being built in and around the same time. Now, as you can see, South Dakota and North Carolina, which is representing Washington here, are both on the small end of the scale. However, if you were to arrange these ships by firepower, they would actually be number 3 and number 4. They would be right next to Iowa, and even then Iowa has the same guns, just slightly longer barrels, giving higher velocity, which isn't always a positive thing. However, they're generally classified as having more firepower. Certainly they would have more anti-aircraft guns. And then of course Yamato with the 18.1 inch guns outclasses everything. But this just goes to show that despite them being two of the smallest designs of this era, they're still fast and quite capable fighters. Now right here is another size comparison. That's USS South Dakota up top next to a repair ship, and then below the repair ship are two Mahan class destroyers. Now a Mahan class destroyer is going to be one of the vessels serving alongside South Dakota in this action, so this will give you an idea of the size of these battleships compared to these little destroyers that are escorting them. And then there I've just blocked out the repair ship so you can just see South Dakota and that destroyer. So overall, in theory, South Dakota is a more effective close-range brawler than Washington is. She's rolling with the same firepower, she's a smaller target, she's 50 feet shorter in length, and she's got the 16-inch armor systems that Washington just doesn't have. However, as we're going to see when the battle plays out, just because something's better on paper, that doesn't mean it always works out that way necessarily. Alright, so we'll start wrapping up here. Here's one last photo of South Dakota coming forward. If you go find this image elsewhere on the internet and zoom in on it, it's fairly high resolution. You can actually see the SG-1 radar fairly evidently at the top of the forward conning tower. And then right here is a very nicely colorized photo of the battleship in 1943, and I have circled and labeled the SG-1 radar where it's at on the ship. So one last thing I just want to point out while you're looking at this photo is the sort of indentation towards the top of the middle of South Dakota's hull. That is a feature that all of the South Dakota class battleships have, and it's a pretty easy way to, again, tell them apart from any of their close cousins like the Iowas or the North Carolinas. So with that said, I'm just going to give you one last photo of each of the two battleships here, and I hope to see you all again in part 2, where we're going to cover the 4 American destroyers that participated in this action. Thank you all for watching.